The corset trend is something that gets talked about quite a bit these days, and it is no surprise. This garment, which began as a foundational essential, ubiquitous as the bra is today, eventually morphed into this highly mythologized, romanticized, fetishized fascination. And it's probably for this simple reason that the corset and corset-like garments have never, probably since around the 18th century, been completely obsolete. This corset trend of 2023/2/1 is just another head of the centuries-old corset hydra. But what I find particularly fascinating about the trendy corsets that I've been seeing online and in stores in the past few years is that these aren't the Victorian-inspired corsets of early 2000s subcultures. The corset tops that we see being marketed as everyday streetwear today have actually taken inspiration from 18th century stays and Tudor-era kirtle tops. So what is the difference? Why the sudden fascination with one historical period over another? Have our perception of corsets affected how we design, wear, and normalize them today versus 20 years ago?
Stalking the shadows of the web, we have the common data broker. Highly invasive, this species thrives on the personal data of internet users like you and me, and is able to sniff out even the smallest of morsels.
Thankfully, I've come prepared with Incogni. Incogni is a service that reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your data removal, and deals with any objections that might arise.
With the amount of data that is collected and sold these days, this process is basically a full-time job, not just finding who has your data and where, but requesting its removal through sometimes intentionally hard-to-follow processes, and continually checking back to make sure new information hasn't been collected. Databases can be breached by criminals looking to commit identity theft, and data can even be purchased by, for example, insurance companies who can then raise rates based on information such as where you live or past health records. Thankfully, Incogni handles all of this on your behalf automatically.
Get started with Incogni today by visiting the link down in the description box below and using my code to get 60% off an annual plan.
I'm scaring away all the data brokers. My extremely subtle worm away. While their time periods, styles, and constructions are different, they're both generally garments with the same primary function, and that is support. We don't yet have bras. It's cold out and skirts are warm, but they are also heavy. So wearing a barrier between your waist flesh and your waistband is actually extremely convenient. The corset of the 19th century evolved from what was known in the 18th century as stays, which gained popularity around the middle of the 17th century. They weren't just relegated to the world of underclothes, and they were worn by all manner of working women to high fashion courtier. They do start to become separate garments worn underneath dresses by the 18th century and are stiffened with firm but flexible materials such as whalebone or bundles of reed. Whalebone, by the way, is the keratin substance in the whale's jaw, not the whale bone itself. It's basically the consistency of human fingernails and softens with heat. The corset, at the beginning of its existence in the English language in the beginning of the 19th century, was mostly unboned, made from soft cotton and stiffened with cotton cord. By the middle of the 19th century, we start to include whalebone and, again, eventually steel. Generally, stays, pairs of bodies, and kirtles give a smoother, more conical shape to the torso as opposed to corsets, which have more of an hourglass shape, with gussets or curves cut to define the bust and hips. Stays are often more heavily boned since these relied more on the stiffening agents for shape. Corsets, on the other hand, relied more on the intricate pattern cutting to achieve dramatic shapes, which required less boning. The corsets that we are seeing now are structurally, technically, more similar to stays. Most pairs of stays don't extend far below the natural waistline, but have a series of skirts or tabs at the bottom, which have been split to allow room for the hips. These skirts were usually, but not always, tucked into the waistband, with only the front and the back peaks exposed, which of course gives the more simplified silhouette that most of our modern interpretations have taken on today. We do have to talk about cottagecore though, because Cottagecore, I think, was hugely responsible for one of the initial stays trend campaigns, and I also think it's at least partly responsible for doing some really interesting things in breaking down a lot of the pigeonholing of earlier fashion corsetry. Cottagecore is an aesthetic centered around a love for nature, the countryside, simple, homemade living, and appears to reject the glamour of urban and high fashion settings in favor of a romanticized, homespun, handmade feel. The fashion tends to favor silhouettes that you'd imagine belong in a storybook. Loose, flowing dresses, puffy shirts, long skirts, and laced bodices have all been widely embraced by the cottagecore aesthetic. And its popularity is generally attributed to TikTok circulation at the beginning of the pandemic, when people were stuck at home, baking bread, and fantasizing about nature. Although, let me tell you, the cottagecore fairy girl scene was thriving in 2014 Tumblr, so like many of today's aesthetics, they've existed long before the power of algorithms were able to push them into more of our faces. Elements of the cottagecore lifestyle can actually be traced back to at least the late 18th century, and to perhaps history's most well-known cottagecore enthusiast, Marie Antoinette. She was said to have had a particular fascination with this romanticized ideal of pastoral life. Situated on the grounds of Versailles was a rustic retreat given to her by King Louis XVI in 1774, which consisted of several cottages and respective farm-appropriate dwellings like a mill and a dairy, around which the Queen and her friends could effectively dress like shepherdesses and cosplay an idyllic farm life. It's possible, therefore, that this is partly where 21st century cottagecore has perceived a natural link with the past, and why the 18th century predecessor of the corset has been favored over the later Victorian styles. Maybe this different style was subconsciously necessary in order to avoid connections with more alternative communities who populated much of the early 21st century interpretations of the corset. The visual difference instead allowed an easy avenue to reintroduce corsetry with the wholesomeness and whimsy preferred by cottagecore. And it seems to have worked. Cottagecore, royalcore, regencycore, whoever is ultimately responsible for starting this 2020s iteration of the trend, or at least driving it into skyrocketing popularity, has made huge strides in breaking down a lot of particularly late 20th century assumptions of the corset as an oppressive, subversive, or heavily sexualized garment, and normalizing it as a more judgment-free item of clothing. I think in part the lack of commonplace vocabulary to differentiate stays from corsets has led them all to just be called corsets, which is actually a positive in this case, I think, because it served to broaden the pool of what a corset is beyond the particular stereotype of person who wears it. She was being so noisy, so I had to bring her with me. Let's bring your pig to work day. Hi, baby. Oh my goodness, hi. But of course, the whimsical stays of cottagecore sit on the shoulders of Our Lady and Savior, Vivienne Westwood, the queen of punk fashion and secret master of historical technique who's been incorporating stays and stays-inspired garments into her collections long before cottagecore took its first steps in the TikTok algorithm. Westwood was a British fashion designer who was one of the founders of the British punk style movement in the 1970s and 80s. But one thing she's been equally notable for in her work is her utilization of historical construction techniques and silhouettes in her designs. From bustles to panniers to farthingales and doublets to, of course, bodices boned in the same manner as 18th and 19th century stays and corsets. She's very well known for the controlled chaos of how her garments drape, and this is achievable precisely because of the detailed understanding she had of the tried and tested techniques that have been employed for centuries to achieve similar results throughout history. And while she was never limited to a specific historical period and certainly was never striving for strict historical reproduction, much of her work does tend to take inspiration specifically from the 18th century, particularly in the understructures she uses to shape bodices. Oh my God, look at your little hands. Oh my goodness, look at you. Many of the garments she made during this time period incorporated corsetry and stay-making techniques in a way that was meant to symbolically express the subversive and rebellious philosophies of the punk movement. underwear as outerwear, the reclamation of a garment which the 1960s tried to make obsolete, and the manifest liberation of the female form. I mean that both in the sense of literally exposing and taking ownership of foundation garments which no longer have to be shamefully hidden and dubbed unmentionables, but also in the control that the wearer has over the shaping of the body that the public perceives. Subverting expectation is a theme in Westwood's work, and her 1987 Harris Tweed collection, which is primarily remembered for its reinvention of the traditional British textile as an item of innovative fashion, is also credited as being a pivotal moment at which corsetry was reintroduced into mainstream fashion, with her Stature of Liberty design igniting a new trend for corsetry as outerwear. No, you are you eating my microphone cord? Oh my God, look at you. All right, I'll put you home, but promise not to make any more noise. This was pushed into further popularity with her Boucher corset in 1990, a distinctly 18th century stays-shaped garment made from lycra and with paintings by Francois Boucher printed on the front. But while clearly taking inspiration from 18th century stays, from the cut of the panels to the combination of vertical and horizontal bones, it's very clearly meant to be an item of fashion, to be worn as a statement and seen, unlike many, although not all, of their 18th century counterparts. And it's this very style that many of the mass market corset tops seem to be following in a strikingly similar manner today. Loosely 18th century cutting and at least the front boning pattern made from modern and often stretchy materials. It just took a couple of decades and the perfect cultural storm for it to really catch on, I guess. With the vastness and speed of internet culture, I don't think it's possible to say with 100% certainty this trend came from Cottagecore and call it historical fact. A trend is the product of a vast and gnarly family tree with branches that span back centuries and, in the case of modern trends, into the deepest, most obscure parts of the internet. What was particularly interesting about the early 2000s, which is the period of style immediately preceding where we are today, is that the corset fascination, for the most part, was rooted in 19th century and especially late Victorian styles. I would postulate that the broad reasoning for this is its relegation, for the most part, to very specific subcultures such as goth, punk, emo, and steampunk, many of whose aesthetics and interests came into contact with these late Victorian art styles and ideas, very literally in the case of steampunk, which is literally a subculture devoted to riffing off of Victorian aesthetics, because corsets and corset-style garments weren't exactly easy to find in mainstream shops that many people had ready access to. Entire communities started springing up in online forums and in spaces such as MySpace, LiveJournal, and DeviantArt, largely made up of people in these alternative fashion niches experimenting with corset making and slowly trying to rediscover those 19th century techniques. You might also have seen the odd corsety thing on a red carpet during this period, but you weren't likely to find a corset-like garment outside of, say, Hot Topic. Unless you were part of a specific subculture, corsetry wasn't really an aspect of mainstream fashion. Meanwhile, today, we not only have corsetry hugely prevalent in red carpet and high fashion events, but we also have corsetry in high street shops, in athletic wear, in designer and indie brands alike. It's marketed and worn in any style genre, from the trend-conscious to the alternative to the whimsical. It's not just relegated to extremely specific events or niches, it's been adapted for all sorts of situations. Through the power of social media algorithms, influencers, and targeted advertising, we all now have the opportunity to be exposed to more content to pique our interest, which means more people in more communities overall. At what point do things stop being considered specific to a subculture? At what point, for example, does a corset stop immediately suggesting goth or fetish over dozens of other unrelated aesthetic genres? Does subculture even still exist? Mina Lay has put out a really interesting contemplation on the subject of subculture, which I will link if you wish to explore this subject further. But with social media, algorithmically fueled trends, the accessibility of a huge range of fashion, targeted marketing, there is a seemingly endless well of style inspiration and so many different style genres to choose from. What happens when some of the cottagecore girlies are also into anime-core or history bounding, and the history bounders are into steampunk or dark academia, and dark academia becomes light academia, becomes pastel-core, becomes Y2K, and suddenly we find ourselves all vaguely linked through a vast interconnected web of cores until we end up with stays in designer athletic wear. It's so easy, I feel like, to come across a hashtag on Instagram or find yourself down a niche talk on TikTok with brands like Shein pumping out tens of thousands of new styles weekly, and the rise of more materially conscious options like thrifting and trading. It's so easy to dip your toes into an aesthetic for a little while and just try things out before moving on to something else. There's no denying the Bridgerton effect in helping to propel this new wave of pre-Victorian corsetry into widespread popularity. When I tell you that every single article from big fashion journalism that I looked at in my research mentioned Bridgerton in an opening paragraph, I mean practically every single one. The corsets we see throughout the series, though, are patently not what is being worn in real-life fashion. Relatively true to its Regency-esque setting, we see some soft cotton Regency long stays and some equally period-appropriate Regency short stays, but we never see the distinctly 18th century construction reflected in a lot of modern trendy corsetry. What Bridgerton does do, I think, is fuel a fascination with the opulent, romantic, vaguely historical and otherworldly, which a parallel pre-existing trend for corsetry can very easily get swept up in. Whether the message is to celebrate or to caricature high society, the aesthetic appeal of the art and design is what captures the inspiration-seeking eye. The Regency period is a really interesting period for dress because while there is definitely a distinctly new silhouette from the 18th century that came before, there is still quite a bit of aesthetic carryover in detail and decor, especially in royal settings where certain traditions are actually fossilizations of the 18th century. And while Bridgerton is by no means depicting the real Regency period, they do give a nod to this existing historical idea. Queen Charlotte and her court are dressed in distinctly 18th century-like silhouettes, which would have within this context been viewed as traditional in a court setting. This aesthetic connection between the Regency period and the 18th century is thus a very natural one and would explain the reinvigoration and even further popularization of an existing infatuation with 18th century stays in today's fashion trends. So today's corset trend, being rooted in 18th century fashion, isn't anything new or completely unforeseen. It's probably the result of a long brewing concoction of Marie Antoinette, early punk style, Vivienne Westwood, aesthetic subcultures moving online, the explosive popularity of historically set media, and algorithmic distribution on a colossal scale. Corsetry will never probably be fully obsolete, but if there's one thing about trends, it's that they are cyclical. Perhaps after a decade or two of 19th century styles, it was simply the natural evolutionary time for the 18th century to be reincarnated. All of this isn't to say that the Victorian style corset isn't still alive and well and thriving in these here 2020s. In fact, late Victorian corsetry, I would argue, is one of the most practical historical foundation garments for everyday wear, at least in its original unreimagined state, due to its benefiting from hundreds of years of engineering innovation and the especially late 19th century value placed on comfort and movement. But I have just been so particularly heartwarmed to see such a previously underrated historical garment such as stays gain so much mainstream appreciation. I am still waiting for the unironic return of the fashionable ruff, though.